Hello, Culture Matters podcast. I'm so excited to introduce you to our guest. But before I do that, here is a quick disclaimer and a quote before I introduce you to our awesome guest. The information in this show is not personal, financial, or product advice and has been prepared without taking into account the objectives, financial situation, or needs of any particular person. Arena Securities does not hold Australian financial services license, is not authorized to provide general personal financial product advice. Before making any investment decision, you should consult a licensed financial advisor. Here's the quote. The reason why we've done so well over a long period of time is we've got good people. And I've always been a great believer that without good people, you don't have a business. People can bugger something up pretty quickly, but good people can keep it going. Robert Milner. Today, I have our dear friend of the Culture Matters podcast, Aleck Arena, who was born at a young age, who at a very young age, I got to do that one. He actually started investing into securities, meeting mentors, learning about how to become not only a seeker of knowledge, but an investor of people, an investor of opportunities. And today we're going to be talking about his story as well as over, I believe, 70 years ago, his grandfather emigrated from southern Italy, Calabria area, with his papa and eventually some other siblings to start this amazing family legacy. I've been able to read the book, The Price You Pay to Be an Australian by Pino Gangemi. And we're going to learn about, and frankly, I picked that quote because it's all about the people. And it was clear that Aleck isn't just a great guy, but he comes from an awesome family, awesome culture. So thanks for coming on the show, man. I got to pick that Robert Milner quote for you about people.
Yeah, it is a bit it's definitely fitting. I would say probably from starting to seek knowledge probably started when I was about 4 years old, if I'm being honest. But even back then, I was actually spending a fair bit of time with Nordnall, like just messing around. A few days he drove me to his farms, and it was funny to go to like a kind of average work day with him, being in the car with him. Somehow, me out of all the other grandchildren, I spent a lot of time in the car driving around with him for various reasons. And you're only really focusing on driving in the car, so there was a lot of time that we had to talk together. I had time to like pick his brains and kind of work out what his perspective on the world was, why it was that way, what had happened like in his life that he had gotten to where he'd gotten to or that point. And yeah, it was very interesting. Obviously, our childhoods were completely different. My childhood was relatively easy, besides obviously I had a few personal sickness issues, but his childhood was obviously it was a complete 180 of mine. I'd say definitely very lucky. I was born in Australia. Very, very easy childhood. It's like born in a Western country. I was so lucky where I was born. Went to school, had a good time, messed around like any other kid. Where Nono was kind of from a different path in life. He came out to Australia when he was very well. Firstly, in the book, it talks about his dad leaving at the port. And even like when I go back and read the first couple of pages of The Price to Pay to Be an Australian, which is his book, I get emotional because obviously it was quite hard seeing his dad leave, come all the way out to Australia. And that was seen as quite of a risky move at the time, and how he explains it to me, because he had a pretty decent job where he was. Um, all of his family was there, so he had like a support network of people that could take care of your children and that. But he summarized the whole situation as his dad came to Australia because he feels like his dad saw trouble in
Wow.
Italy. He that can't remember how many brothers and sisters Nonno had, but there was 7 or 8 kids, and that area of Italy didn't. There was the mafia was around, so he was trying to seek a better life for his kids because obviously, if you're a product of your environment, so he was scared that someone was going to run off in the wrong direction there. And so he came to Australia by himself and tried to start, like I'm talking about my nonno's dad, tried to start a better life, like get a bit of money and then bring everyone else to Australia. And he was able to do that in the end. But Nonno even talks about like he was at school getting really good grades and everyone was telling him that he shouldn't go to Australia and that he could get a job in a bank or he could do this and
Yeah.
that. And his dad was like, "No, I want you to come to Australia." And then they came to Australia, and pretty much, uh, there's a big gap in time that happened. But if you just shorten down the story a bit, his dad then started farming because that's what they knew how to do because they came from a farming background. Where they're from in Italy, it's all about like farming, the olive trees. You gotta love the olive trees. And so they came to Australia. They started a farm up in Yarloop, and Nonno talks about them renting the farm, and he's there now in his older teenage years. And he, they sent, I think they were growing potatoes at the time, and he sent these potatoes to the market. And he talked about like he's in his teenage years, and he'd worked so physically hard. Um, And he goes, I never forget, my dad came back from the market and we got a bill. And he just said, we were renting the land. We'd sent the potatoes to the market. He transported the potatoes there. And then we got a bill. And he was like, why do I want to plant potatoes again when I'm half a chance of getting a bill? So yeah, he obviously then ventured off. He was trying to work out what made money and where made money in farming. He started milking in dairy, and it was all at like a really young age. Like he used to cycle to work from his dad's farm to another farm to help out people to get paid to provide for his family. So him and his older other brother pretty much worked from a very young age and helped support and provide for the family. And obviously his dad was working too. And from my understanding, his mum was mainly taking care of the younger siblings. But yeah, he definitely has some stories. I'm probably going to jump backwards a bit here, but when his dad first left Italy, he was left there obviously by himself with his mum and his siblings, and they had some olive trees. And that part of Italy, it's fair to say it's fairly hilly. So he had to go pick the olives, but first walk there with like a picking bag pretty much, and then walk back to the town.
Wow.
And yeah, and imagine being a kid, you're about 12 years old, and you've got a picking bag on your back, it's full of olives, you're walking downhill, you're walking uphill, and he's walking for kilometers, and he's just a child pretty much, but like shows about his nature because even back then he was very unselfish because he was told like he was going to help the family. He was the first. He was like he was there. He was the first person there to try to help out the family, from what he recalls. But yeah, he was like, I didn't want to let my mum down. I didn't want to let my brothers and sisters down. And then he talks about like just leaving Italy, and it was he talks about it as like a terrible feeling, to be honest, and because you're leaving a familiar environment. Um,
He
he
had to
said
be
he
born
kind of
in, wasn't he born in the midst of the World War II or in that reign?
yes, if yeah, we can go backwards. We can flick back a bit on that. So he was born in World War II, and he recalls very, very clearly. Um, this is quite funny because you're American. He recalls very clearly that there was it. he said it was very, very random. One day, all these like big tanks and little trucks turned up, like
Wow.
as in four-wheel drive utes, and came like running down the street. And everyone was they were throwing chocolates to the kids and like all this food. And he recalls like when World War II ended, it was such a happy time. Maybe just for him because he got some chocolates, but yeah, apparently the Americans kind of like drove through the towns as if it was kind of the Italian team had won the soccer title, because that's what used to in Italy when someone wins the Serie A, the supporter base from that fan club drive through every town they can, pretty much beeping, honking their horns, jumping up and down. But he said it was a similar kind of thing, but they were throwing chocolates off to the kids and giving like obviously small bits of food out, which they appreciated very much because it was a bit like it was obviously a bit of a hard time being around World War II, as in he didn't understand it at the time, but the trade system wasn't what it was before because obviously all the men had gone off to war, and if all the men were doing picking and farming and this and that, your trade system slows down because they're not there anymore. They're at war. You've lost some of them.
So do you think that his father, so Pino's your grandfather, he was like 10 when this is going, when Joe was coming to Australia, his dad, so that's your great grandpa on your mother's side.
Yep.
Do you think Joe, he thought after the war, the economy is going to slow, let me create a better life for my children. So he
Uh,
emigrated to Australia.
I don't think I don't think he had a pretty interesting macro view there. I
He
don't
was
think he was
thinking
quite
like
the
Aleck
economist.
Arena Securities. Yeah, yeah, yeah. You know what I'm saying? He
uh,
understood. This is funny based on the other cover. He understood the macroeconomic, the shifting plates, right? You think he
he
invested?
maybe
He sounds like
he
an
did a
investor,
bit. I
honestly.
think he was just more concerned about his children and that it maybe wasn't a prosperous place for all your children to come up and grow. So he like obviously saw a new land and a new place full of opportunities to be more prosperous, as in
Wow.
there'd be opportunities to provide for his children. They wouldn't run into trouble, as in like obviously the mafia and like initially it was kind of hard because you paid your tax and then you paid your tax to some other people too,
Wow.
because everyone was yeah. So and you didn't want to get caught up in the wrong gist. Apparently, Nono reflects on it as like his dad had quite a good relationship with the mafia, as in that makes it sound bad. But just if you let me explain, like he used to manage people's land kind of, and they he was like quite an honest man and an upfront man. So his relationship with them, they never had any run-ins or anything. But it's hard to make a living when you're getting taxed twice, if you know what I'm
Wow.
like.
Yeah.
It's imagine getting in any economy if you get taxed twice, and if you're trying to raise a lot of children, which they were, the opportunity's not there. And then if most of the young Nonnel's dad felt like most of the young people were falling into the mafia pretty quickly, and it was like that they thought that was their way of life and being prosperous, where he was
Wow.
kind of scared by that because he's like, well, I don't want my kids to end up in a bad place. I don't want, like you can understand
Dude,
where I'm
it's
going with
amazing
this.
because it's like it's a cultural conversation. He wanted to protect his family from gang, essentially.
Yeah. But I'm surprised because when you talk to like anyone about Australia, I'm surprised you thought it was safe. Because like when you go to Italy or whatever, and you say you're from Australia, or you go even like when I was in America like a few months ago, everyone looks at you twice, like you've come off the plane fighting snakes and kangaroos and all
That's
this stuff. But which is not the case at all. But yeah, I'm actually surprised because the perception of Australia around the world, and I think at that time too, would have been that it was a colony that was establishing itself, but there was a lot of wildlife that Europe definitely didn't have.
do you think he had vision? Joe?
My grand, yes, I do. He definitely had a lot of vision to up and move himself to Australia. I also think my nonno had a lot of vision too, but it's a risky call to go. Well, it's not a risky call. It's I can't say what I would say on a podcast, but it takes a lot to move your family from across the other side of the world, pretty much throw away your support network. And yeah, he had a few people in Western Australia, like a few family, friends, and all that. So that's why they came over to Western Australia. And yeah, that's kind of how they got established. But when he came over, you still needed a person to sponsor you. So you had a good party, like a good friend. And if anything went wrong, he pretty much took the flak for you. And there was pretty much kind of like a bond amount, I would say. Um,
Wow.
so making sure someone else sponsored you to come out to Australia and kind of vouched for you to say, yeah, this person's going to work hard, he'll contribute to society. Um, yeah, so it wasn't easy. And then he was able to save enough money to bring his whole family out. And then obviously, Nonno had to go off to work when he was really young in Australia. Didn't do, obviously, no formal education, but he
Wow.
finished school in like, I think it would be like year six, year five, back in Italy.
Wow.
So when he left Italy, that was school done for him. Was off to work. So I can't imagine being 10 years, 10, 11, going off to work, like every day. And yeah, then he evolved. He worked out he was working for for like a milk farmer, and he worked out he thought there was money in that space, and it was a more prosperous way of farming than growing potatoes and kind of like trying to grow vegetables because that's what his dad was used to, and that's why he planted vegetables. And then Nonno kind of got into like they had a quota with the milk, so each farm needed to produce so much milk. And you could say he was kind of ahead of his time, was an investor and all that, because he would work out how much cash each farm produced, how much it was to buy the farm, and then obviously one farm would pay itself off, and with the cash flow from that farm, he'd go buy the next farm. So he was pretty much running with a roll up model. Like
Yeah, I
they
think
bought one farm, saved up the cash flow, bought the next farm, expanded out. So they had all these farms all across the place. But that pretty much came from him
wow.
with his dad because he was a teenager going, well, if we're getting a bill from taking the vegetables to the market, I don't. My mum's got to support. Like, where's mouths to feed on the table here? Mum's taking care of the kids. We got to somehow come up with money to feed ourselves. So that came through him. He went to work. He saw an opportunity that the farmer he was working for made good money. Well, not make. He made enough money to support himself and his family. And yeah, that's where the idea of milk farming came around for him. And yeah, it was fairly prosperous for him. But you go when you talk to Nonno about farming, milk farming, dairy, he reflects on he was quite good friends with Walter Brown. So he was an older gentleman and mentor of his, which was established in quite a big way in Australia. Sorry, in Western Australia. So he owned Brown's Dairies.
Hmm.
Um, which is the friend of him, the friend of my nonno's, and he was uh, just let me check. I think he was about 30 years older than nonno. He was a fair bit older, and in the book, if you've read the book, there's a photo. Just let me. I can't remember what page it's on, but I should be able to find it. There's a photo of them together and his family. It's on page 33. Um,
Yes.
and so yeah, ex-manager of Brown's Dairy. So obviously Walter Brown, he was a mentor of Nonno's, and Walter had done well for himself. Was an Australian he was from Australian background, which is kind of like interesting to think of. Well, I don't know. I feel like the Italians kind of stayed within themselves, and he branched off and was friends with a Australian. The Australian guy was very nice to him, very good to him. So Nonno was obviously the same back, and he spent a bit of time with him traveling the east coast of Australia, and he would definitely help mentor him a lot, and had talked about his life experiences to him because Walter Brown had kids, and Nonno was just getting to the stage of starting a family and all that. So he was able to pick his brain and figure out what worked for him, what he should do, what was to come. Because they were over at the East Coast, because Nonno loves to tell the story. One of his bulls, so we have royal shows in Australia, and you take your bulls and animals off to the royal show to win prizes. So Nonno, the biggest show in Australia is the Royal Sydney Easter Show. So Nonno took, like, he had to travel across to the other side of the country with his cow. He would sit there with it, and it took multiple days to get to Sydney from Perth, and you have to clean up after it and the rest. And he's gone to Sydney, and he's won the best. He's won the prize for the best cow, and I'm pretty sure he'll take that to the grave. He'll let everyone know about that. That's one of his proudest achievements, winning that. Yeah, we actually went back to the Royal Sydney Easter Show about 5-6 years ago now, and his face was something I never forget. Like walking around and seeing all the animals in the yards, but it's quite funny because obviously it's mainly, if you're a young kid, you want to go on all the rides and that, and it's kind of ventured off into a different path. But seeing all the animals was cool, and he loves the farmers, and he loved speaking to all the farmers about their animals and where they farmed, and if they were in drought or what conditions it was over the East Coast. And did you know this person from 40 years back? Because he was a really nice bloke and he helped me out. But yeah, that's a quick summary of Nonno's story. Obviously, if you want to reflect on any points within the book,
Yeah.
I should be able to answer them, because he also they moved quite a few times. So they moved from Yarloop to Byford. So they were further south of Perth, and they moved north closer to Perth. And then he's moved from, obviously his family was around Byford, then he moved to Mundajon, which was kind of close too, but still milk farming, still doing the same stuff. So yeah, that's kind of his story in a quick summary. And I haven't brought anything to justice because I haven't delved deep enough, but I want to see what you want to say, Jay. So,
Well, for the entrepreneurs that are listening, what about Pino, your grandfather, value wise, character wise, do you think led to this success? Because you're talking about a 10-year-old kid going with their father across, to a different country, and from scratch building a farming, very successful, huge farming business.
yeah, he
What types of
definitely
character?
helped build a family empire, I would say.
Yeah, so like
What
the
types of,
listeners really need to understand, like, because right now there are people struggling listening to this in the US because of where we're at in our economic state with money. So like, I think it's a very inspiring story for listeners right now. Because clearly he went from nothing to building a very big success, to the point where I could talk to you right now, you're his grandkids.
yeah, I saw him yesterday, and I said, it was quite funny. I said, Dondo, I'm going. First of all, when I told him I was going on a podcast to talk about him and his life, he laughed and he thought it was quite funny because I explained it like it's like the radio. And he said, Alex, can you even speak yet? Can you put a sentence together? Because he's always joking around. And he said, I said, oh, that's quite interesting. Definitely someone from America wants to know about me. And he said, I said, what do you want? Like, what's your main point of what you want to be reflected on? And he said, I just I tried my hardest always and was always willing to learn and was always up for a conversation with anyone and everyone, no matter where it was. And yeah, for one reflection on my life is that I maybe always didn't do it right, but I always tried my hardest and was like obviously extremely determined.
How important in your own life up to this point do you think those rides were, when you were the mentee and he was the mentor? Because that mentee
And
mentor dichotomy is so important in this to culture matters.
you can kind of say it shaped. I still go back and I look at like what he was. I kind of dissect what he was doing when he was, because how he explains it to me, and what he was doing when he was a young kid, looking at the farms and working out how much money they need to buy the next farm and how much he was really looking at how much cash the farm produced, Jay. So he was actually, in a way, he was pretty much doing a reverse discounted cash flow on the
Mm.
farm. So he was ahead of his. He was pretty much sitting there in a similar mentality to what Charlie Munger was doing and going, like, this is how much cash we need by the next farm to pay this one off. And he, some of his mentality is kind of the same as Charlie Munger's in workout. Like Charlie's obviously extremely big on working out how not to kill. So, like his thing is work out where do I? Sorry, let's start again here. Um,
Oh, the invert,
where
the
am I gonna
work
die? Yeah,
backwards. You meant
yeah.
the
He would always work backwards, but he talks about like knowing if he knows where he's gonna die, he'll just never go there, and then he'll be fine. So like working backwards, like he talks about when with the weather patterns when he was at World War II, Charlie Munger does, and obviously working out how do I kill my pilots? Okay, let's work backwards because I don't want to kill any of my pilots. So it was kind of the same mentality with the farms, and that's always something that Norton was really big on. And still, like I was a young boy, and he would always be writing stuff down, kind of like journaling,
wow.
um, trying to work out. He didn't realize it, but he was very big on like reverse discounted cash flows. So he would go through and go, how much, like if it was sand, milk, whatever it was, what do I think? How much cash can I pull out of here? Then what's it worth? And that's how he'd think about stuff. So even when he bought a farm, it was his first thing he would do. How much rent can I pull out of it? How much milk can I pull out of it? What do I think the price of milk's going to be? How fast is the payback period? What are rates if I'm borrowing to obviously buy this? Um, sometimes he didn't. He talks about he went down to Margaret River, which is a very scenic location in Western Australia, and he was absolutely gobsmacked by it, as in it was amazing scenery. And he was like, I just fell in love with the farm. I saw this farm, I fell in love with it, and I thought I needed to own it. And that's a predominant wine region in Western Australia and Australia. And yeah, it's also known for the surfing. I don't really know much about surfing, but they do a surfing tour just right there. So all the international surfers come right next to these farms and wineries for this amazing surf setup, pretty much.
For those that don't know the term, discounted cash flow is what?
You're discounting the cash over, like, so you're trying to work out what an asset is worth, but you're discounting the cash from your risk-free rate pretty much. So you're trying to work out how much cash you can pull off it. And you're discounting it over time because you're trying
Mm.
to work out like what return you're going to get with 10 years if it's 10%. So obviously in 10 years, you're going to have the whole asset paid off. And you pretty much, it's a fancy way for what Norton would say is doing your sums and doing your due diligence.
Right.
But yeah, it's
Is
not, it's probably just a fancy way of saying it, to be honest, mate.
is the value there so you don't overpay for things?
Yeah, he's definitely overpaid for things and he's definitely made mistakes in his life. not often though. And with time and a pretty prosperous Australian economy, those tailwinds have helped him out a fair bit. But yeah, there's multiple things that Nonno's done in his life, which is just absolutely amazing. And
Wow.
yeah, real credit to him. With Walter Brown, he talks about, because Walter Brown had a lot of money at the time, and he talks about everyone being very jealous of him.
Wow.
And he used to say to me, I just couldn't understand why everyone was so jealous of him. He'd done so well for himself. Why wasn't everyone proud of him? Because we have this thing in Australia where you guys don't have it in America. It's quite an interesting thing where we've got more of a tall poppy syndrome. So if someone's doing something that's amazing or cutting edge, we'll try to cut them down and give them no credit for it.
Wow, really?
And I'm not a fan of it, but it's kind of what happens. So everyone saw this guy, Walter Brown, making a lot of money and all that. And then was like, well, what is he doing? I got to try to figure out what he's doing. Like, he's like not trying to work out his secret sauce, but just like, what's he doing? It's quite interesting. Obviously, he should be really happy, really proud of himself, and he's done well for himself. And everyone should study him, like as it's a case study for the local society. But most of the local society didn't really see him like that. They saw him as a I don't know. It's like the connotation that comes with him, like as a stuck-up person or whatever society thought he was. But he definitely wasn't.
How important do you think mentors were for
To
that business
Nonno,
growth?
I
Yeah.
think mentors were absolutely huge. I think Walter Brown was absolutely huge for Nonno. And it's even something that I've obviously, because when I used to sit in his car and it used to drive me around, it's something that I worked out that having good mentors would just help you a lot in life and take you, I think, take you to great places and fast forward your journey a bit because they've done stuff that you haven't done yet, and they've experienced stuff that you're going to experience. I know on the last podcast I said that it's like Kobe Bryant watching Michael Jordan, like
Yeah.
trying to figure out that one day you're going to be in that situation. And it comes back to kind of entrepreneurship, is that like maybe what Warren Buffett did 50 years ago, I'm going to face tomorrow, next week, next month. There's a lesson there. You can learn something from their lesson. Hopefully, you don't make the same mistake. So he did a lot of that from Walter Brown, and I would say that set him up and that helped him a lot.
What about this idea of talking to people? I wrote this down. Where's the page?
Nonno was
Yeah,
definitely
always be up for a
he's
conversation.
he definitely still is. I don't know. It's definitely something about his personality that he's always up for conversation. I was out with my mates the other day, and they were like, "Have you ever met a person that's an extrovert that always loves to talk to people?" And I was like, "No, there's not many people that are usually like that." Then I thought about it, and I was like, "It would definitely be if I have ever met someone like that. It would definitely be Nonno. He was be at the petrol station. He'd want to know the bloke next to him in line's life story." See if he could work something out for himself or see if there was a lesson in it. Like he didn't care who he was talking to. He would give he would give anyone, I don't know if you say this in America, but he would give anyone the time of the day, be nice to everyone. Yeah, and there's lessons to be learned from everywhere pretty much. He had very unique ways of doing things at times, and I think we all have a lot of funny stories about him. But yeah.
What do you think we can learn about entrepreneurship from farming?
I definitely think farming's a thing where if you put, obviously you're prone to the weather and weather cycles and drought and that stuff. But if you put, and definitely back in the day, it was probably a bit more prosperous. But if you put in the work, obviously there's a fair chance you could reap the rewards. You definitely learn about hardship and how to deal with stuff. When something goes wrong, it might actually be able to teach you about life and how to cope and how to stay mentally prepared, keep yourself fresh. Um, it obviously, I think living off the land is a great experience, but it also, I think farming can teach you about community a bit because it can be lonely at times with farming if you're out, especially out in a big farm. So obviously, knowing your neighbors, occasionally catching up for a beer. I don't know, farmers, they'll help each other out a lot. Like if something goes wrong, call up the next door neighbor, he'll be able to come over and help. Stuff I don't think would happen in more city areas. I don't know if it's the same in Miami, but the bloke down the road's probably not going to want to help you install your washing machine or something else. Where if you're in a farming area, your cow gets out and breaks the fence, you're getting like 10 calls saying like,
Wow.
do you need some help? We'll come. I put your cow back into your paddock. There's a hole in your fence. I've tried to fix it. Yeah, it's just a very different cultural environment, kind of. And I feel like the further out you get, the more of a community it becomes.
What would
The
you
more of
say,
a raptor.
what family
Yeah.
values you think have been important in the growth of the family businesses over time?
So it kind of did branch out in the end because Nonno's story from his career perspective was that he I wouldn't say he was bored, but he obviously wanted more for himself and was always striving for pretty much personal excellence. So he branched out into real estate. So he was milk farming, branched out to real estate. And here's a lesson for all young entrepreneurs listening. He pretty much, there was a flood of Italian or ethnic immigrants coming into Australia. And most of these ethnic immigrants were, sorry, 2 seconds. Most of them were from obviously the same background as Nonno was from. And he had a competitive advantage, is in they would be from Italy, Spain, wherever they were from. They all kind of, when you're from those areas, they all have a bit of a farming background. So they come to Western Australia, the first thing they want is a farm. So obviously, he wasn't as good with the English, convincing the English people how to buy a farm because he wasn't amazing. His English was, he taught himself English, so his English was pretty good, but it wasn't as good as maybe he didn't know the ins to say with the English people, as in like he didn't really know how to sell to them. So when the Italian people would come over, he had the competitive advantage because the Italian people couldn't understand English. So he could speak to them, he could explain to them what the land was used for. He was very, very good to them, would help him out with obviously contracts and all that. And he would help explain because he was like a translator, he could convert it. So if you needed to buy a farm and you're from a European country, you'd come to my grandfather because
Wow.
you can't speak English, and he's just translated the whole thing to you. Obviously, Google Translate wasn't around back then, so he made his competitive advantage in real estate with selling farms was definitely that, and yeah, definitely did make him a fair bit of money, and made everyone else a fair bit of money too, because they bought their farms in the right areas geographically for rain and for growth, and yeah, definitely helped out quite a few people.
I'm so ignorant on this.
Sorry.
Like, how much land is out there? Because you're in
In
the
what,
Western
Western Australia?
Australia. Yeah, like I don't really understand.
Mate,
I don't even know.
we're actually the second biggest state in the world, in Western Australia. So Nunu never went north. He did in his old age. There's a property 2 hours north. He only usually was south of Perth. So to get to the top of Western Australia from Perth, it'd be about a 2.5 hour plane flight. So, not even really at the top, you're just at Broome. So you're kind of close to the top of Western Australia, and that's not from the bottom, so it's a pretty big state. Sorry, can I just pause it for a second, Jay?
Yeah.
So, 2 seconds. I just wanted 2 seconds. I just got to turn the heater off. It's getting hot.
Well, he came from a different country, not knowing the language. How did he actually teach himself the language? The reason I ask that is there's people right now have plenty of reasons, you know, that we give ourselves not to succeed. But like at the end of the day, I don't need to be learning a new language to succeed right now in this economy or this. So like, how did he teach himself how to do that? And what can we learn from that?
So pretty much credit to himself. He left school initially when he was, I can't remember if it was year 5 or year 6, but let's call it 10 or 11. Never went back to school. Obviously, English wasn't a subject that was taught in Italy at that time. So he came to Australia, couldn't speak the language, worked out that he needed to be able to communicate with everyone if he was going to make a go of it. And he was able to try to kind of ask most Australians about, like, I don't know how he did it, but he would ask him like about their like way of life and kind of what they did and all that. And from there, he worked out that most Australians at the time got the paper and like obviously they would order the paper in and they'd read it in the mornings.
Wow.
So, and obviously he knew the paper was written in a different language. It wasn't written in Italian, so it was written in English. All the Australians could read the paper, so that must be the native language. Then from there, he would sit, like, apparently he used to sit in a room and he used to just read the paper and try to translate it. And he would have like a notepad, but he would could write the word down and then try to memorize it and work out what he meant. And sometimes he would also write the word down in Italian next to it so he could like translate it. There's some things that don't translate from Italian to English. So that could have been challenging. And I honestly think English is one of the hardest languages in the world. So just the thought of learning English in without a teacher, you're not at school, you're a kid, and you're sitting there by yourself with a paper trying to learn this different language. That's yeah, that's amazing. I have no clue how he did that. But he was yeah, I'm actually just blown away by that, honestly, because I definitely know I couldn't do that. It shows to me, it shows like a lot of determination. He obviously wanted more for himself. It also shows me that like anything's possible. Like obviously in America, you've got a lot of immigrants and migrants, and maybe English isn't their first language, but people always complain and make excuses. And like for him to showcase that anything can be done, you can teach yourself a different language in a different country when you don't understand anything, from just knuckling down, working very hard. Do you want to quickly ask me about the when he went to see Nonna in the
Absolutely.
shop
I think we were talking about that on our first podcast. Again, if
podcast?
anyone hasn't heard that podcast, I challenge you to listen to it. We go deep into investing and theory and as well as a bit of the story, but and really we were talking about, I was asking about, and I'm still curious about this, the, you know, I guess all right, so I'll say it this way. I think that Culture Matters is where it's at today because of the relationship between me and Jenna, my fiance. Hopefully wife by the time this is out. And I can't imagine this without her. So I was asking about, when I was reading the book, basically Pino asked to go on a first date, asked her dad to go on a date. And it was like such a culture shock to listen to that. And so, yeah, I'd like to learn more about how they met and
Oh,
what you think, the impact of their marriage on just everything, right? Because that's an important
yeah.
piece of culture, I think. Family.
Obviously, yeah. I'd obviously just like to start with like I don't think Nonna would have got as far without Nonna. Obviously my grandma, because obviously someone back at the house to hold down the family, help support you mentally, help at times. She helped support him physically. Like she would actually go out and work with him if he needed a hand and someone was sick. I think she's definitely been an amazing wife to him, and I don't think without Nonna, I don't think he would have gotten as far. But the story of the shop is so the last episode, Jay talks about Nonna going up to this shop and I would say weirdly courting a young lady. So pretty much the story goes he'd heard that Nonna was he worked further south and he'd heard it was like a local shop kind of to the area. They used to sell groceries and all that. And Nonna left school early, so similar story to Nonna. She'd left school in Italy, gone to school in Australia for a few years, and then finished about year seven. So she was 12. And then she used to work in the shop with her parents, because her parents owned a shop at the time. All the school kids would come in and get groceries, get choc milks. Like you'd have parents come in, and it was just like the local kind of grocery store. So Nonna came in. He'd heard about Nonna from a friend that this young lady had worked there, and he had this massive order of groceries he needed. And he came in like a business shirt and all that. Like he was dressed to impress pretty much. It was fair to say he was lost for the area that he was in. He didn't look like he was supposed to be there. And Nonna recalls him as being quite an annoying an annoying man because he was following her around and making sure she got all the groceries and that, and she couldn't work out like why he was there or what he wanted. And yeah, he actually did a grocery order that big because he wanted to work out if she could like read, speak English. Like he wanted to work out a lot about her personality, what education level she was at. Which was quite. I kind of feel like it was quite a cheeky thing to do, to be honest, Jay. I don't know if you. um, I
Yeah.
I kind of it's kind of a bit. I'd say a bit cutting edge and a bit rude. He basically gave her an English test on the spot and wanted to see. I'm
Yeah.
surprised he didn't sit there and mark it after. But yeah, then obviously back in the day, especially being from an Italian background, you could pretty much only marry an Italian, and their parents would look more highly upon you if you married someone from the state. He was real happy because Nonna actually was from the same state as Nonno in Italy and was from a respectful Italian background. So he had to go. It's what he did at the time. He went to Nonno's father's house. And he knocked on the door and he asked for her hand, pretty much out on a date. And if she was the older daughter, pretty much you were fine to take her out. If not, they would try to offer you the one that was the oldest daughter.
Wow.
So yeah, I know because Nonna was one of seven, so that was kind of weird because maybe your oldest daughter maybe might not be ready for the relationship yet, but definitely played into Nonno's favor that he was Italian. He got along with my Nonno Scalacci very, very well. They were also they were from a farming background and they had a farm too. So Nonna was probably the perfect woman in many senses because
Wow.
she obviously knew how to read and write. She was an Italian immigrant from the same state. And she grew up on farms so she knew what it took to live on a farm and all that. Obviously, at the time, she didn't really know much about Nonno. And yeah, it's fair to say he picked well. But I even look at my nonno Pino absolutely loved my nonno's dad. So he loved his wife's dad and the wife's mum. But the amount of respect he had for nonno's dad was insane. Nonno's dad was such a hard, proud man, to be honest. He fought in World War II and was stuck in he was pretty much a prisoner of war in Poland.
Wow.
he was married at the time and had a few kids with my nonna, and they were living in Italy. I think they'd had 2 kids. And he survived by eating potato peels that were pretty much rotting out of the bin. He was stuck in there for months. He was cold. Um, like I, it's a story like I have no clue. He obviously the strength he had to get out of there and to keep on going, and then you've been through World War II. You're so lucky that you've survived. You've survived being stuck in a bit. You've survived being a prisoner of war in a completely different country. Like he's from the south of Italy. It's usually hot in the south of Italy. It does get a bit cold. It does snow sometimes, but he's stuck in Poland as a prisoner of war. It's snowing. He doesn't have many clothes. Obviously, you're not showering or any of that stuff. Yeah, living off scrappy old rotten potato peels, and yeah, that that's definitely an amazing story there. And so Nonno Pino definitely had a lot of respect for Nonno Scalacci and what he did for the family and how he raised the girls and how strong of a man he was. Obviously, he then came back from war, and then instead of rolling over and saying, I've done my duty for life, he thought he was starting up a young family, and he was like, he had a similar story to like Nonno Pino's dad, as you said, Joe.
Wow.
As he needs to come to Australia and start like obviously he needed to get money to bring Nonna Nonno Pino's wife to Australia, and he came to Australia. Pretty sure on one of the first days he actually broke his leg. Had to get that healed up, and then once he'd done that, he got enough money to bring. I think he went back to Italy and then brought everyone across to Australia.
Wow.
And yeah, just like so, I would go to his house because Nonno Scalacci, I was extremely thankful that he lived till he was in his mid 90s.
Wow.
And I was able to spend a bit of time with him, and he was obviously a great grandfather of mine and
Oh,
a pretty inspirational character, as in he still worked in his garden
really?
hard into his 90s. He's kind of like the Warren Buffett of Pinjarra.
Wow.
Still goes hard when he was in his 90s. He wouldn't like he wasn't a fan of the air cons as every old Italian man was. So yeah, Nono absolutely loved him because he was like, this guy works really hard. He's very dedicated. Yeah, so they got along amazing, and yeah, it was an amazing story really of how they met, how he really respected the Scolacci family, and yeah.
How many years of hard work and struggle and adversity, did it take for things to start really going and building in a momentum direction? And the reason I asked that is, Bill Gates said, we overestimate what could be done in 1 year, but we underestimate what could be done in 10. And that's always stuck with me. Like I believe like we're 4 years in a 10-year sacrifice kind of thing. So I'm curious,
Yeah,
how long did it
I
take?
understand what you mean. It's it's kind of well for
Let me get this straight. It was the 49 when he came over, right? And then
yeah.
in the teens, they started doing the dairy. And it was it early
Mm.
20s when they got the first farm?
But yeah, that's all true. It's kind of like I don't know if the struggle ever ended, if I'm being honest, because even though they had money, they were prosperous, they weren't living amongst their means or doing anything like that. Like they were living,
Frugal?
I don't know, it's a kind of classic Southern Italian way to live. Like just live on like the bare minimum. You don't need to look flash. You just want fresh tomatoes and pasta for dinner, pretty much.
That's
You're
awesome.
not trying to, you're not, yeah, you're not trying to do too much else. So
That's like Warren Buffett that lives in the same
it's hard.
house? right?
Yeah,
Warren
it's hard
still
to
lives in the
say that.
same house.
Yeah,
But like,
it's
what about the
back to my
business? Was it
grandparents.
20 years?
Oh, the business was probably,
Like, how
I would
long did it
say,
take to
from,
get there, you know?
I don't actually think, like, I don't think it was that long from the stories I've been told. I think it was only, the payoff period was definitely favorable. It, it's a hard question to answer because what do you determine as ended the struggle? Like, they always had food and all that because they would sacrifice for that. Um, but maybe living at a surplus. I don't know what you would classify as the end of struggle because yeah, I just come back to the same points as they didn't have like lots of like they didn't need to like they weren't showing off or anything
It
and they
wasn't
didn't
ego.
need a lot to live. What,
Like,
sorry?
like they
I
weren't
would
coming
I
from
would
ego.
I would only say that it took them a couple like I would say a couple of years if I'm being honest, Jay, from
Wow.
buying the first dairy. But then they obviously wanted to set up a bigger support network because they knew everyone else was getting older. They weren't highly educated. What was everyone else going to do? So then it was like, well, we need to go buy more dairies and work together as a family, as a team. If we do that, we can cut costs together. We can share certain items from farm to farm because the farms were geographically pretty close to each other. So when you can do that and you can work really well as a team,
Wow.
you then you cut costs together, and they kept the whole family of all the children. Don't exactly know when they split up, but they kept together for many, many years. And I think without family, they wouldn't have got as far. Like if Nono went off on his own, it would have been much harder and the struggle would have lasted much longer. But they kept together. So then you had a guiding kind of figure, as in Joe Gangemi, as in Nono's father, was still able to help guide and kind of keep the family together, if you kind of get where I'm coming from.
Well, so you're saying it was a handful of siblings that all worked together. They pooled their resources and their time.
In the end, yeah, in the end, it was the whole family worked together.
Wow.
All
That's
the kids
amazing.
worked together. They all had farms. Who who was perceived to be working harder and all that. It was a different thing. Like they got married. Nono got married, but he was still working as part of the family business. So then it got to a stage where Joe, Nono's dad, was like, "We can't keep going like this because Pino needs a certain block of land for his family, something for them to live off. And if my other son wants to go sell his block and do something else or whatever, that shouldn't impact Pino or Nino or whoever else it was."
Wow. You know, in closing, what do you think is the most important variable that our audience can take away to
I just
we
think
want to create a family legacy, you know, where their
I was
their kids are honoring them
I
on a
think
show like this. You know what I'm saying?
I think hard work. If you work really hard, you're very determined. You also somewhat keep a bit of an open mind, room for growth. Um, that I think if you work very hard, your family and kids will always respect you, and that's definitely something Nono always did. And yeah, it's just a story in pretty much anything's possible, anything can happen. If you really put your mind for it, you work very hard, within time, it will come to you. Also, you can kind of learn if you're being an entrepreneur that having a competitive advantage is important. And with the farming, because they were able to share facilities and certain things, it gave them a lower operating cost than other farmers in the area, which obviously helped them out with time because it's also given them a competitive advantage. So kind of comes back to learning about how you get your competitive advantage in business, what's your point of difference. Um, Also with like translating the stuff to your when he was doing real estate, translating to your Italian customers that are looking to buy a farm. It comes back to the same concept of hard work, competitive advantage. Yeah, I think you'll be able to build quite a. Well, I'm only young, but from what I saw from my nonno, the takeaways would be like if you're hardworking and you, when you work really hard, your family should be able to respect and see that you have worked really hard and helped them out and like you've he could have stopped working as hard as he was a long time ago. But he liked working and thought about like this is going to help my family down like down the bloodline. If I keep working, I've helped future generations out. I've helped my kids out that well, yeah, his kid. There was times where he was like, I'm helping my kids out. I don't really know who they are yet. And he was, yeah, I would say he was a very unselfish man. So hard work, determination, unselfish, keeping an open mind, always talking to everyone, being very willing to learn. And he was a massive reader. He loved reading. Nothing more than the Farm Weekly and the papers. But yeah, that would be my takeaways. Sorry for rambling.